explicitly stated. And so the idea was that under Sola Scriptura, you have to be able to prove every Christian doctrine from Scripture, either by finding it explicitly stated or by, as the Westminster Confession puts it, by good and necessary inference from things that are stated in Scripture. And that was the standard way that the doctrine was presented. Other Christians who didn't adhere to Sola Scriptura were criticized for having unbiblical doctrines, ones that couldn't be proven from Scripture alone. And so that was the general conception. But in more recent years, now Catholic apologists pointed out big problems with that understanding. For one, it doesn't meet its own test, because there's nothing in Scripture that states or implies that you have to prove every doctrine from Scripture alone. It's just not there. There are a few verses that Protestant apologists would try to use to support the idea, but when you examine them carefully, they actually don't support it. They don't prove what is intended. And so in recent years, Protestant apologists have begun taking another tack where they restrict the definition of Sola Scriptura to, I think, to make it a smaller target, so that it's harder to criticize it. And the new definition that's used is Sola Scriptura means that Scripture alone is the infallible rule of faith. It's the only infallible rule of faith that we have. And so that's the new claim. But I don't think that the new definition really is that helpful. Now, first thing I'd point out is, theological terms can be used in different senses. And so, if you want to redefine a term, okay, fine, we can talk about the new term and, the new definition that you're using. But if you look like in Protestant confessions of faith, like the 39 Articles of the Anglican Communion or the Westminster Confession that's used by Reformed and some Baptists, or if you look at, the Book of Concord that's used in Lutheran circles, none of them identify Sola Scriptura as this. Right. They will say things like Scripture is the only infallible rule of faith, but they don't say that's what Sola Scriptura is. And they also say things like you have to be able to prove doctrines from Scripture either explicitly or by good and necessary inference. So they contain both ideas. And recent Protestant apologists have been restricting the term Sola Scriptura to just the first of those two. But that leaves open the question, well, then, so is Scripture sufficient to give us all of Christian doctrine? And Protestants typically will say, oh, yeah, it's Scripture is sufficient. The sufficiency of Scripture is still a true doctrine. And I don't think, and it's just a different doctrine than Sola Scriptura. And so, okay, fine, if you want to use terms that way, that's okay. But I don't really think that helps you, because if you believe in the sufficiency of Scripture to teach us the whole of Christian doctrine, then you're going to have to be able to prove the sufficiency of Scripture from Scripture alone. And there aren't passages that state or imply by good and necessary inference that every Christian doctrine must be proved by Scripture alone. So I think that that this move, while it rhetorically, for debate purposes, can make some sense to try to make Sola Scriptura a smaller target, it really doesn't help, because the problem replicates with the sufficiency of Scripture. And so I don't think it's an ultimately successful move.